Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of AZ Security. My name is Dinan Paardenkoper. I'm a cloud security architect at IT Impressive, and today I have a special guest, and that is Ru. Ru, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I appreciate the invitation. So I'm
You're
I'm
welcome.
Ru Campbell. I'm a Microsoft Security MVP. I do kind of a little bit of everything. So I do Defender. I got a couple books out on Defender. I do a lot of Entra stuff, Purview stuff, Engine stuff, just Microsoft 365 security in general. That's the kind of stuff I get involved with.
And how long are you MVP already?
Oh, that's a great question. It would help if I could remember. I want to say, I'll tell you what, I'll look up at my little thing there. I got one. I'm 5 years, 5 years, hopefully a sixth year. I'll find out in like a month or
Nice.
two. But yeah, 5 years so far.
Yeah, it's quite exciting, right? Because this week we will hear if we are renewed, right?
Oh, is it this week? Oh, I try not to
Yeah.
think about it. It's in the hands of the gods at Redmond. So we'll see what they decide.
True. For today, we talked about it. What would be an awesome topic to share? We came up to the common Entra security mistakes. Do you want to share something about this?
Sure, geez. How long do we have? So before we start
30
recording, obviously,
minutes.
yeah, we might do a little bit in 30 minutes, but I guess when we talk about common Entra security mistakes, there's no shortage of them, is the first thought that comes to mind. Microsoft are increasingly doing a really good job of security defaults. So they've hardened the out-the-box settings in a number of areas. I think of areas such as OAuth consent, which we can talk about more if we need to. They've introduced things like Microsoft Managed Conditional Access policies, which go a long way. But at the end of the day, Entra is a big and a complicated platform. And even beyond just Entra, the standards on which Entra is built, such as OAuth, they're not perfect, right? And they're like any other
No.
tech, and they can be exploited. So it's still subject to a few of those, I would call them modern identity platform industry concerns rather than just Entra-specific things. So yeah, we can dive into any of that stuff.
Let's do it.
Cool. Okay. Well, geez, where do we begin? I guess maybe the first thing to say is we probably shouldn't broaden the scope of this episode to cover Entra agent ID. So anything about agents and AI and all that kind of stuff, this is a safe space. And let's not dig into that yet. I'm going to share my screen.
Cool.
And let me know if you see this, because we can dig into some specifics with a little bit of a demo. A live demo, geez, how about that? That's a high risk scenario. So hopefully you'll see my screen just now.
Screen is there.
Great. So I'm in my lab tenant, and I'll just kick about this, and I'll just go into, hey, let's say you're a customer of mine, and I'm doing a security assessment, and I'm, walking around your tenant, and I'm kicking the tires on it. What am I looking for? Well, one of the big ones that I still find folks getting caught out with, and I'll cover some basics, then I'll maybe get into some more advanced common mistakes. Cool. Let's go to enterprise apps, and let's go to consent and permissions first off. So this is one of the areas that is being hardened. I mentioned earlier that Microsoft defaults are improving, but they're still not maybe flawless. This page here, this is everyone who does Microsoft Entra security will have probably been in this page 100 times and seen 100 misconfigurations. And so what do I mean by that? Well, consent, this really just means allowing applications permission to your data. So for example, let me head to enterprise apps here. And let's pick on this one by this notorious fella, Dr. Azure AD. And I'm going to go to permissions here. So we get this enterprise app in my tenant. This app exists in another tenant as an application object, and then it moves into my tenant as an enterprise app. And you can see here, well, what does it need? It needs permissions, and these permissions are very basic. It needs access basically to these permissions, which will let the app do single sign-on. Super basic stuff, not an enormous security concern there, right? But if I find some other applications, this is one I love to pick on, called, if I can pronounce it right, how are we going to pronounce that? Calendly? I've said this probably 100 times. Let's go Calendly, and we'll head to permissions. We're going to head to user consent here. And here we go. Look at all these permissions. So these are a permission type that's called delegated. That means it will get the permissions of the user who is signing in on a kind of interactive when they're using the app experience. And then if we go down here, we can see, okay, so they've got those same single sign-on type permissions that we've seen in the other one. But in addition to those, we've got user.read. That means it's going to be able to read the directory within Entra. And maybe I would say of this one, the higher security risk, well, hey, this app, all of a sudden it has permission to read and write my calendars, including shared calendars. So keep that in mind, right? So we're talking about these permissions. This app has permission to the data that we're seeing here. And in this example, it's calendar stuff, right? Now let's head back to that page. So I'm going to go Enterprise Apps. I'll go Consent and Permissions. And we're looking at this. Now, I would say maybe the more risk-averse option here, and my personal preference, is you want to choose this button here. Do not allow user consent. I sometimes describe these three settings as the good, the bad, and the ugly, insofar as one is like the gold standard, and then the others are just not terrible, but not as good. So do not allow user consent. But what we do is we couple that with this thing called admin consent settings. And that basically allows your users, when they go to sign into an app like Calendly, to request permission to it. So the point here is it's gated by an administrator. We've done quite a good job as an industry over the past 5, 10, 15 years of making sysadmins understand that on endpoints, Windows 10 and 11 endpoints, you don't want to give your end users local admin typically, right? But then when we moved to this concept of the cloud app, we kind of threw all that away and we said, well, sure, we'll just let users use any app they want. This is contending with that problem where actually what we're going to say is, don't allow the user just to do it, go through an admin consent flow. Now, here's where Microsoft have made some improvements. You'll see here this one below that is called Allow User Consent, okay, for applications from verified publishers, getting better for select permissions. So what this one means, this is a little bit higher risk, but it's not terrible. And this means that if the app is via a verified publisher, and you can do that as a Microsoft partner, you can become verified. That's at the tenant level rather than the application level. So it doesn't mean anything about the app being safe. It just means that publisher is known. And then you can choose, well, hey, for those permissions at a verified level, it doesn't have to go through an admin, right? Because maybe that's a lower risk profile. And then the third option, this is the one that's relatively new, is called Let Microsoft Manage Your Consent Settings. And so this joins a lot of Entra capabilities where we would call this a Microsoft managed value, where if I choose this, it basically means, well, whatever Microsoft decide is the best practices for consent, we'll just follow those. So what that means is some permissions are high risk and therefore they won't be allowed by the user. They have to go through an admin approval flow. But for those permissions that are less risky, allow the user to do it without admin consent. And if we click into the docs here, this is where we get into a little bit of the nuances. First off, you can pre-approve some apps. So for example, whenever you use one of the built-in mail clients on mobile operating systems, that's an enterprise app within Entra, so you can pre-consent those. You'll see here, this is a very interesting list. So this is the list of permissions that Microsoft say these are high-risk permissions, therefore the user doesn't get to give away them. The user can request it, and then an admin can approve it. And you look through that list, and it's all quite intuitive, right? So as an end user, I can't give away read-write access to a mailbox. I can't do similar for contacts, stuff like that. So this is all pretty good start. But then what you actually have to do is infer the things that might be missing from this list. So for example, you look at this list and there's nothing to do with OneNote notebooks. So a user could consent to an application and could get permission to OneNote notebooks. So you get the idea.
Yeah.
It's contextual based on your own risk appetite. It's a good start, but it's not perfect. That gold standard, like I recommended, one of the biggest mistakes I see in so many tenants is that you're not choosing this. And then you can have a whole bunch of, you can have custom RBAC roles if you really want to go down that route, et cetera, et cetera. But at a high level, this is your gold standard for consent and permissions. And listen, that's just one of the common mistakes that we see people make. There are an awful lot more. And then let me show you another one that's kind of new that might catch a lot of folks out. We have this thing called authentication methods now. And that's where you can choose what type of authentication strength is required by Entra. So for example, we used to just say, hey, require MFA. Now what we can do is we can say require specific types of MFA. And one of the recent changes within FIDO2, passkey being kind of the new industry terminology for FIDO2, with the introduction of it on mobile phones, is that kind of by default now, if you set this up, the default would allow this type of passkey, which is the synced passkey. And this is a whole, I would say, borderline like a theological discussion about are synced passkeys secure and safe and all that. The bottom line is there's trade-offs, but this is one of the defaults that kind of exists when you start setting up passkeys. So the common mistake we might see here is that folks will have the same rule for everybody. Hey, everyone in my tenant can have a synced passkey. Well, why might that not be ideal? Well, let's say you've got your global admins. Maybe you want to have a device-bound passkey for that type of high-risk user. And then there's an accompanying mistake we see a lot here, where under this section here, this is where you target your profiles to different users. These kind of apply with an OR logic. So for example, if I went here and I said select targets, and I'll choose like an admin group, and then I'll go here and I will choose, let's say, an internal group. And I don't have multiple passkeys profiles in this lab tenant, so it's not going to be a great example. But let's say for this group here, let's say I said this has to be a device-bound passkey. And then for this group here, I was going to allow it to be a syncable passkey. Well, if I have crossover and I have users that are in the internals group who are also in the admin group and vice versa, then actually what happens here is these policies get merged so that it applies with OR logic rather than being exclusive or most restrictive. So that catches a lot of folks out insofar as you would intuitively think, well, hey, if I've said for admins, you have to use a device-bound passkey, but for this other group, you have to have you can use a syncable key. And if you're in both groups, the most restrictive one will apply. To me, that's the intuitive thing. That's not how Entra plays it out. It will use that OR logic and it will see if you satisfy any of those. So again, just another example I can think of off the tip of my head of common mistakes in Entra security. And yeah, that maybe gives you a little bit of an insight into the scale of the challenge that your average admin faces, because some of that has been around for a long time, like OAuth consent. Other parts of it, like the passkeys, they have not been around for that whole time, right? This is new stuff you have to keep up to date with. And even I struggle with it.
Indeed. And that kind of, what you mentioned, the OR, that's one that a lot of people don't know about. Acting like, hey, we are safe. But instead of being safe, you can also exclude yourself out.
Indeed. And it's, I think it's because, for example, if you then pivot over to something like conditional access, the general rule with conditional access policies are that the most restrictive one that is in scope will win. So if I have 5 conditional access policies and they all apply to me at that point of sign-in, that point of authorization, then whatever is the most restrictive is going to win because they all apply at once and everything gets merged. That's not the case with those passkey profiles. So you have to learn one operating model for one area of Entra and another operating model for another area of Entra, just to keep you on your toes there.
Indeed.
And I guess maybe I'm trying to think if there's any other little common mistakes. I think of adversary in the middle. And that's one of the big things that everyone's talking about now, right? Token theft through what is most commonly used by security researchers being evil jinx. And there's a little bit of common mistakes, I would say, out there with regards to, well, how do I actually defend against it? So for example, if you have a policy that blocks non-compliant devices, and there's multiple ways to achieve that, you could go in here and you could say require compliant device here, or you could say require hybrid join device, or you could choose block access, and you could then filter it. And you could say, okay, for anything that doesn't equal compliant here, then block access. The common mistake we see here is just folks not understanding that if you go down this route, you're also going to defend against adversary in the middle, because the attacker server in the middle, they are not going to be a compliant device, and therefore the whole attack is going to fall through. And really that's true of any device state property that you choose here, because all of these require that device to exist within Entra, either registered, joined, or hybrid joined. So there's some really quick wins you can make for phish-resistant authentication. While going out and, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a massive fanboy of these little keys you get here. I get too many of them now, to YubiKeys and all the other vendors, Token 2 and such. But you don't need to go out and pay for them, right? You could just use stuff you're already paying for, i.e. Intune compliant devices, hybrid joined devices. And even what I'm increasingly finding, I really need to do a little bit more research on this, but what I've recently been testing is that on mobile devices anyway, if you have a policy like, let me see if I can find it. Here we go. Even if you have a policy that requires an app protection policy, I'm actually increasingly finding that this will also give you phish resistant, because this actually requires a device registration object in Entra, which that man in the middle can't get. So a whole bunch of counterintuitive ways to defend against adversary in the middle that folks just aren't aware of.
That's a good one.
And I guess I'm conscious of time here, because where do I head next? There's so many. Let me think. More common mistakes. Let's see, where do I head? We could talk about custom security attributes. This is a very fun one. So I'd say this is one of the more advanced areas of conditional access. And the mistake here is just folks not being aware of it, not using it. Where, let's say, for example, you set up your conditional access policies. And how do you do that? Well, you're probably like a conditional access admin role, or maybe you're a security admin role, right? But we want to get to that lowest possible RBAC configuration. And let's say, for example, one of the common policies that folks try to do, and I've done a number of times, might be one that looks like, but for example, let's create one then. So I'll go to new policy, and I might do something that says, you know what, if you're on a BYOD device, and I'll do this just by saying filter for devices, we're going to exclude anything that is compliant. So exclude is compliant true. Yep, there you go. We're going to block access. I won't bother setting up users or stuff. And then we get this target resources. So again, another area that's just really misunderstood within conditional access. So target resources used to be called all cloud apps. Resources is something you'll see in your Entra sign-in logs. Fundamentally, it's the API that's going to receive access tokens. And what you might do is you might say, well, if you're not a compliant device, therefore you're BYOD or something like that, then we're just going to block everything, right? All cloud apps get blocked. Except you might then go to exclude and then choose specific resources. And you might say, well, I'm going to exclude Office 365 because I'm going to let folks do Office 365 on their BYOD device, something like that. And you'd have other policies that then protected Office 365. But where one of the kind of cool things conditional access can do that is underutilized is this option right here, select resources based on attributes. And I say this with the context of role-based access control, but also with just making policies a little bit tidier. So what we could do is we could go in here, we'll filter this, and we will have these attributes set up in the background. You see here, I've got a group called conditional access, called BYOD access, and I'm going to say contains true. And I'll hit done. And you can see what it did there. It basically set up this rule that said, well, hey, if an application, if an Entra resource has this attribute against it, where BYOD access equals true, then we're going to exclude it from the policy that blocks BYOD apps. And why is that useful? Why would I do that instead of going in here and saying, okay, well, in addition to Office 365, I'm going to allow Azure AD internals on a BYOD device? The reason you would go down this route is this list here, this can get quite unwieldy, right? If you've got 10, 15, 20 different things in here that can get unwieldy. But in addition, in order to edit this policy, number one, it's a high-risk thing to edit any conditional access policies. Because if you do it wrong, you could lock everybody out of the tenant and break loads of stuff.
Exactly.
Right? So it's a high-risk thing to do. So you might want to keep that away from folks. So what instead you might do is you might delegate permission to assign these attributes. So we define the attribute in here. It's got its own RBAC role that's just going to allow folks to manage those custom security attributes. Then what they can do, or they could do this if, for example, they're the owner of the app, then they could go in here and say, oh, you know what, Google Workspace, we're going to take that as well. I'm not sure I got this RBAC role in my lab account that I'm in with just now, but let's find out. We're going to choose add assignment, conditional access, BYOD access, assign values, true. And therefore, what I've done here is I've allowed this app BYOD access, or I've changed the conditions under which conditional access is going to process it, but I didn't need conditional access admin rights to do that. Or I didn't even need to touch that conditional access policy. So it keeps that risk down. And it also just makes it a little bit more easy to manage. Because then what I could do, for example, if I've got a nice little, all of this is subject to how you manage it internally within your organization. But if you have a good naming convention, you have good hygiene over this kind of thing, you can then easily inventory things. And you could say, get me the list of all the apps that folks can access on BYOD devices. And boom, you can just do it like that without having to touch conditional access. So the common mistake there, it's just an unawareness that this kind of thing is there and available. Maybe for folks a little bit further in their maturity model, but yeah, that's one example that comes up a lot.
I really like this situation because then you basically just can leave all your controls intact, right?
Yes.
Instead of every time changing or adding a new application or that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Whenever you add a new application, you don't need to edit the conditional access policy. You do it all within the actual application itself. And I'd need to fact check myself on this, but it might be the intuitive thing might be, well, hey, the owner of the app gets to do that. I'm not sure of the RBAC implications around that. If, can an owner assign these, or do they also need because there's a custom RBAC role that allows a custom security attribute assignment
for modification?
Yeah, I need to check that, but yeah, that's the kind of thing. And actually that brings me nicely on to a common mistake you do see with these enterprise apps is this one down here, assignment required. And that is where something that a lot of folks don't really think about is that this gets enforced before conditional access gets enforced. So the cool thing about that is if you've got conditional access policies in place that are like, hey, block this user from this application, well, you probably don't need that. You could just do it here. And so this is the first kind of chain of events that would happen when Entra is deciding whether tokens are going to get issued or not. And then what you do from there is you would maybe say, yes, require assignment. And as soon as you do that, it means that this app will not be accessible until you have assigned users over in this area here. And as soon as you start assigning folks in this area here, that's when you can do it. And from there, that's where you really get into this really cool art of the possible type situation where you can start applying identity governance on top of it, right? And access packages and entitlement management and all that cool stuff. But yeah, this is a really, really good starting point for a lot of folks to start reining in Entra permissions for their apps. And geez, I'll take a time check there in terms of how much more time have I got here to blast you with Entra. Bring it on. Okay, right. Geez, where do we head to next? What will be a good one? Like I said, there's a lot of option here. Let's head to tenant governance now. So shout out to Thomas Nonheim, MVP, about this stuff, because if you want to talk about tenant governance, Thomas is he's the GOAT there. But let me explain some of the mistakes I'll see folks make here. So what is cross-tenant access? Well, it's all about the fact that your users within Entra, they may not just exist in your tenant. And likewise, users who are housed in other tenants where they're a full member, they could become guests in your tenant. The most common scenario you'd see that would be, hey, I invite someone into a file in OneDrive or SharePoint, or I invite them to join a team. Well, they become a guest in my tenant, even if they're not my native user. So that's quite a common admin scenario. And there's some cool stuff we can do here that isn't exactly new, but it's still not commonly seen. So I'll head to the default settings to talk about this one. You can control this per tenant, but I'll talk about it at a default level. Let me head to inbound defaults. And I'm actually going to head to trust settings because this is a cool one. Now, let's say I invited you to be a guest in my tenant. This is what the defaults are going to be. And if I have a conditional access policy in my tenant that says you need to do MFA, then it will actually make you register MFA again, right? If you're a consultant or a contractor, one of the kind of recurring laughing points is you open your Microsoft Authenticator app and you could just scroll for days and days and days and days and days because there's like 500 accounts in there. Why is that? Well, it's because whenever you become a guest in another tenant, you have to set up MFA for that tenant. Even if you're using the same email address, the same account, MFA is going to be in that tenant. What you can do is you could head in here and you could tick this box here. And what ticking that box is going to do is tell Entra, hey, if that tenant sends the trusted signal, in that token, it says they've satisfied MFA previously, we'll take it. And it means they don't have to register MFA again. So we will require MFA. We'll just trust their tenant to have passed that on to us. So that is a good quality of life thing. And it's also a prerequisite to requiring phish-resistant authentication. So if I have guest users and I want my guests to use passkeys, I have to trust MFA from their tenant because you can't register a passkey in multiple tenants. And then equally, you have these other kind of signals that you can receive from guests being trust compliant device and trust Entra joined devices. Similar idea, it's just at the device level insofar as, hey, all of a sudden I can receive as a guest signs in, I can see in my logs where they sign in from a compliant device as their tenant seen it, right? So I don't get to control the compliance policy. I just get a signal to say, hey, yeah, as far as their tenant's concerned, it's a compliant device. Well, you can then start enforcing conditional access on the back of that, which is pretty cool because you could say, well, hey, if through becoming a partner of our company, you have to verify that you use Intune and you have compliance policies, it restricts your guests from using BYOD devices fundamentally. If you think about it that way, right? Insofar as if I have a law firm that I work for, I want to make sure they're only signing in from devices that have met the security standards of that law firm. That idea, that's what we're achieving here. And you can do that with either device compliancy or with hybrid join state. So you can turn this on. It's very low risk, at least for these two. Very low risk to just go ahead and turn that on because you'll get the signals. You don't have to do anything with it, but you'll get the signals. And then you could create a conditional access policy later that would enforce it. And one of the cool things you could do is you could put that in report only mode. So you turn this on, you then create a report only mode policy that says, hey, for the law firm, if any of their guests sign into my tenant, report only mode require compliant device. And then if you start seeing all this stuff saying, well, you know what? They're all compliant devices. Maybe it's a safe thing to go and turn on. So the common mistake there, I guess, is just that folks aren't paying enough attention to this type of thing. Let me think. Where do I head next? There's so many. I kind of want to revert to form and talk about conditional access some more because that's just what I do. But maybe actually I'll go to users and I'll go to user settings. And I'll talk about some of the ones here that are sometimes overlooked. This one here, this causes no end of problems. Guest user access restrictions. Why does this cause problems? Because this one used to be a lot easier to explain when it wasn't called Entra. So it used to be called Azure Active Directory. And the clue is in the name. It's a directory. It's a book. You open it and it tells you it tells you their name, their phone, their address, etc., etc. It's a directory. Guest users, kind of out the box with Entra, they're basically treated just like normal full members. They can look at the directory, they can see who's in it, they can look at groups, they can look at roles, they can look at admins, all that kind of stuff. And that can be counterintuitive. So what you can do is you can flip this switch here called guest user access is restricted to properties and memberships of their own directory objects. Bit of a mouthful. But essentially what that does is it stops guest users being able to enumerate the directory. It says most restrictive there. The consequence you need to be aware of there is it might break some stuff. So for example, if a guest user is using Teams and they're trying to look at the global address list and add people to a team or something like that, it's going to control their ability to do that. So A lot of these recommendations depend on what type of risk you're willing to tolerate. Depending on the client, this is one of these settings that I quite often will say, just turn it on and then wait for someone to complain. And if they complain enough, then maybe you reverse it. But it's, it does have its consequences. And then there's just other...
Your practice is then option 3, unless they are complaining.
Yeah, it's the most secure one. But if this isn't going to fly and your guests do need access to, those global address lists and stuff like that, then consider moving up the chain accordingly. It would be quite rare you would choose this top one here. I'm not aware of any of my clients, for example, that would do that. And some other common mistakes you might see in here, this one comes up quite a lot. Keep user signed in. So when you sign into Entra, it's got that little box that says keep me signed in. And there's like a running joke on LinkedIn and on Twitter that's just a big lie because everybody clicks the box and it never remembers their sign in. The reason that happens is that conditional access will win over this. So for example, if you head back to conditional access with policies, and I'll filter mine to ones to session control that have something called a sign-in frequency or a non-persistent browser session, this is going to win. And so this brings me on like a huge other common mistake I see is that this concept here, the sign-in frequency option in conditional access, if you get that wrong, it's a really effective way of getting your users to just hate you with no real security benefit. I don't mind the users getting a bit annoyed if you get a good security benefit out of it, but it is quite misunderstood. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I get some random policies here that are really just there for placeholders. But if I pick, let's say, this one here, internals, all apps, manage desktop sign-in frequency of 14 days. This is basically saying every 2 weeks, we're going to force the user to sign in again. So we're going to say those tokens they've got, they're not valid. The default, I believe, is 90 days or 3 months out of the box. But you really have to question, what is the security value I'm getting here? If a user is signing in using Windows Hello for Business, and that's phish resistant from the get-go, it's tamper protected because of the TPM. It's, it gives brute force protections and all that kind of stuff. I get a pretty good high signal right there that this is the real user and it's not a adversary, not a compromised account. And therefore, do I really need to interrupt the user's flow in order to satisfy that? And so, for example, one of the common ones I might see here is, I would say at the worst end, folks would not say 14 days. They would just say all users, sign-in frequency. I think the worst one I've seen is something like this, 2 hours. And it's just like, yeah, it depends what your current posture is like, but that's probably going to cause more problems than it's going to fix. What might be more realistic is you could say, well, hey, if it's an unmanaged device, then limit it to 1 day, because it means the token, if it's stolen, is going to be, you're just lowering the risk of token theft for devices that are sitting on the device. Anything more than that, and all but the risk, and all but the most high security scenarios, just isn't worth it. Especially when you've got stuff like Windows Hello for Business in there, that's going to take care of a lot of that stuff anyway. So yeah, again, another mistake that comes to mind is just the misuse of that. And then I guess there's a related one. If I change away from sign-in frequency and I go to persistent browser session, this one can sometimes be misunderstood insofar as if we choose in our policy to say never persist, then that's kind of an honor system dependent on the browser. So what it means to do is say, as soon as the user closes the browser, then disregard the cookies and make them sign in next time, right? So you know what it's like. You're in Outlook at the web, or you're in some web app that uses Entra to sign in. And as soon as I close that browser, well, keep me signed in is forgotten, and I open the browser again and I have to sign in again. But like I said, it's an honor system. Insofar as if you have configured Edge, because everybody should be using Edge, if you configured Edge to do something like retain persistence of open tabs, so that when I close Edge, all those open tabs resume, that is considered a persistent browser session, because we're asking it to persist even after I've closed it. So it's a bit of an honor system in that regard. So it's maybe not giving everyone the protection they think they're getting, but for a lot of cases it's still quite valid. If it on BYOD devices, if you target it to those, I think it still makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. Hey, Ru, I think you can talk for hours and hours, but I think we have to round up for today. If we can combine all those security methods which you explained, I will bundle them in one or a two-liner. What would it be?
Wow, the one or two liner to secure Entra and avoid common mistakes. I guess it would be follow me on Twitter. No, I guess it would be the bottom line is you want to really, really finely balance that productivity versus security dichotomy. Like a lot of the mistakes we see are actually folks who think they're getting security, and in some degree they are, but they're just making life for their users miserable, right? And they're maybe not intuitively following the flow of events. So for example, if I think back to that cross-tenant settings where we're trusting the MFA signal coming in, your intuition might say, well, why would I trust that other tenant's MFA? I want to trust my MFA. Well, the reason is because you're going to smooth the joiners, movers, leavers process for guest users, and you're going to allow phish-resistant authentication, right? So digging underneath the surface value that you're seeing in the Entra Admin Center and understanding what's really happening and the real risk profile, that's how you kind of start maturing your Entra tenant, how I summarize it.
I think that's more than one sentence, but that is very great. Now, awesome to have this explanation also for your demonstration. If I'm new to this topic, where would I go? As a final question.
Great question. Well, number one, I'm a consultant, so I can't answer just one or two sentences. I have to answer in big paragraphs. But also, if you're new to Entra, I can tell you what worked for me. Number one, make a lab tenant and just break it nonstop. Just tinker with it. Number two, the Microsoft Learn documentation is outstanding, especially if you find stuff you don't understand. Just feed it into an LLM and interrogate the LLM to help you understand it. And then the third one, I joked about this earlier, it's follow the right people on social media. Pick your poison, pick whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter, and follow the right people. Because if I think back to when I really, really started digging into Entra, going back, like 7, maybe 8 years ago now, I would say maybe 25% of what I learned was in the docs, and 75% was just following the right people on Twitter, because they talk about things that you can even imagine and they'll just open up your eyes. So yeah, following the right people in the community is a big one.
Thank you very much. And let's wrap it up for today. Once again, thank you very much for the information. Also for the straight into demo. Very love that. And for everybody at home, I want to thank you very much for your time, also for listening. If you have any things or thoughts, please leave them below. And I would say thank you very much, and till next time, take care.